"This disaster is entirely your fault, Jessica," Thomas said. His voice cold as he stared me down across the boardroom. The boardroom felt like a courtroom, and I was the accused. Thomas stood at the head of the table, his voice sharp and deliberate as he addressed the senior leadership team. "The Paramount Industries deal collapsed because of poor risk assessment and failure to communicate critical concerns," he said, his eyes scanning everyone except me. Then he paused, turned, and looked directly at where I sat. "Jessica's oversight on this project cost us millions," he said. My throat went dry. The words hung in the air like smoke, choking me. I wanted to stand up, to scream that this was a lie. But my body felt frozen. Around the table, executives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Some looked at me with confusion, others with disappointment. No one spoke up to defend me. Thomas continued his presentation, as if he hadn't just destroyed my reputation in front of the entire leadership team. He clicked through slides showing charts and timelines, carefully curated to paint me as negligent, and him as the hero who tried to save a sinking ship. My mind raced back to the dozens of emails I'd sent him over 3 months, each one flagging the exact issues that eventually caused the deal to fail. He'd ignored every single warning. I couldn't stay silent. My hands trembled as I reached for my laptop, pulling up the folder I'd organized specifically for this meeting. "Thomas, that's not accurate," I said, my voice shakier than I wanted it to be. "I sent you multiple warnings about the structural problems with this deal. I have the documentation right here." I turned my screen toward the group, showing the first email I'd sent back in March, clearly outlining the risks with Paramount's financial backing. Thomas's jaw tightened. "We're not here to make excuses, Jessica," he interrupted, his tone condescending. "The fact is, you were the project lead. The responsibility falls on you." I felt heat rising to my face. "But you told me to proceed despite my concerns. You said the client was too important to lose, and that I was being overly cautious." Several executives glanced at Thomas, waiting for his response. He smiled, the kind of smile that made my stomach turn. "I don't recall any such conversation," he said smoothly. "And frankly, trying to deflect blame onto your supervisor shows exactly the kind of accountability problem we're dealing with here." The humiliation crashed over me like a wave. My mouth opened, but no words came out. The meeting ended with vague statements about reviewing the situation and learning from mistakes. I gathered my things quickly, avoiding eye contact with everyone as they filed out. My colleague Vincent touched my shoulder briefly as he passed, a small gesture of sympathy that somehow made everything worse. Back at my desk, I stared at my computer screen without seeing it. My phone buzzed with a calendar notification for a meeting with HR scheduled for later that afternoon. I hadn't created that appointment. The rest of the day crawled by in a fog. When 3 o'clock arrived, I walked to the HR office like someone walking to their own execution. Karen from HR sat across from me with a folder and an expression of practiced neutrality. "Jessica, we need to discuss your future with the company," she began. The conversation that followed was dressed up in corporate language about mutual understanding and transitional opportunities. But the message was clear. I could resign voluntarily, or they would terminate me and mark my file accordingly. Either way, I was out. By Friday afternoon, my desk was empty, packed into 2 cardboard boxes that sat in the trunk of my car. That night, I sat on my living room floor surrounded by printed documents. Sleep was impossible. Every conversation from the past 6 months replayed in my mind, like a broken recording I couldn't turn off. I joined the company 18 months earlier, excited and ambitious. Thomas had seemed impressed with my work initially, even mentioning me for a promotion. But something shifted after I started raising concerns about the Paramount deal. He grew dismissive, then hostile. Now I understood why. He'd wanted someone to blame when things went wrong. And I'd made myself the perfect target by being thorough and honest. My printer hummed for hours as I made copies of everything. Every email I'd sent Thomas warning about the deal's structural weaknesses. Every memo I'd written documenting the financial red flags. Every timestamp showing when I'd raised concerns. And when those concerns were dismissed. I organized everything chronologically, creating a paper trail that told the real story. I didn't know why I was doing this or what I thought might happen. I just knew that somewhere deep inside, I couldn't let the lie stand unchallenged forever. The truth existed in these documents, and someday someone might need to see it. Word traveled fast in our industry. Within a week, everyone in my professional network seemed to know I'd left the company. The rumor mill was predictable. Poor performance, failed project, mutual parting of ways. Some people reached out with sympathy. Most stayed silent, protecting their own positions by keeping distance from professional failure. I applied to dozens of positions, customizing cover letters, and rehearsing explanations for why I'd left my previous role. Seeking new challenges sounded better than scapegoated by my director. Most applications vanished into the void without response. The few interviews I secured always stalled at the same point. "Can you tell us about the Paramount Industries situation?" they'd ask carefully. I tried to explain without sounding bitter or defensive, but I could see doubt creeping into their expressions. Thomas's version of events had reached them first. Meanwhile, I heard through former colleagues that the company was struggling. The Paramount deal's collapse had triggered a chain reaction of problems. Other clients were questioning the firm's competence. Internal morale was sinking. But none of that brought me satisfaction. I just felt tired, angry, and desperate to find somewhere that would give me a chance to prove myself again. The rejection from Crawford and Associates hurt the most, because I genuinely thought that interview went well. I sat in my car in their parking lot afterward, fighting back tears, when my phone rang with an unknown number. "Hello, Jessica. This is Denise Kellerman from Pinnacle Consulting," the voice said. "I received your application last week, and I'd like to talk." Pinnacle was smaller than the firms I'd been targeting, but Denise's straightforward manner during our phone conversation was refreshing. She asked direct questions about my experience, and seemed more interested in my actual skills than in industry gossip. When I came in for an in-person interview, her office had none of the corporate pretension I'd grown used to. It was professional but welcoming, with actual plants instead of the fake ones that decorated most executive spaces. Denise was in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair, and the confident posture of someone who'd built her company from scratch. "I've heard some things about what happened at your previous firm," she said after we'd talked through my portfolio. "I've also heard from people who worked with you there that you were excellent at your job. I'm more interested in the latter." She offered me a position as a senior consultant at a salary lower than what I'd been making, but with something I valued more than money at that moment, a genuine chance to rebuild. I threw myself into work at Pinnacle, with an intensity that surprised even me. Every project became an opportunity to prove my worth, to demonstrate that what happened at my previous company was about politics, not competence. My first assignment was helping a mid-sized manufacturing company restructure their supply chain. I spent late nights analyzing their logistics, identifying inefficiencies, and creating detailed recommendations. When I presented my findings, the client was impressed enough to extend our contract. Denise noticed my efforts. She started assigning me to more complex projects, including client presentations I'd normally have been too junior to lead. With each success, I felt pieces of my confidence returning, like a puzzle slowly being put back together. I didn't talk about my past with my new colleagues. When they asked where I'd worked before, I mentioned the company name but kept details vague. I wanted to be known for what I could do now, not for what had been done to me. Slowly, the weight I'd been carrying began to lift. I started sleeping better. The knot of anxiety that had lived in my chest for months began to loosen. I was building something new, something that belonged to me. where my voice actually mattered. 4 months into my time at Pinnacle, Denise called me into her office with an unusual expression on her face. "We've been approached by a significant potential client," she said, gesturing for me to sit. "They're looking for someone to help them evaluate and restructure a major partnership deal that's been problematic." She slid a folder across her desk. When I opened it and saw the name, my heart stopped. Paramount Industries. The same company whose deal had destroyed my previous career. I must have gone pale because Denise leaned forward with concern. "Are you okay? Do you have history with them?" I took a slow breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "They were involved in a project at my last company. The one that didn't go well." That was the understatement of the year. Denise studied my face carefully. "Can you handle working with them? I need to know if this is going to be a problem." Thought about it. The old fear tried to resurface. But something else was there too. This was a chance to face the situation that had nearly broken me. But this time with control over the outcome. "I can handle it," I said more confidently than I felt. "Actually, I might be the perfect person for this. I know exactly what went wrong with their previous deal." I spent the next week buried in Paramount's files, studying their current situation and comparing it to the deal structure I remembered. The patterns were obvious to me now, like reading a language I'd become fluent in through painful experience. They'd attempted to salvage the original deal structure after my old company's relationship with them collapsed. But they'd repeated the same fundamental mistakes. The financial backing was still unstable, built on assumptions that couldn't withstand market fluctuations. The timeline was still unrealistic, creating pressure points that would inevitably cause problems. Even some of the same vendors were involved, the ones I'd flagged as risky in my original warnings to Thomas. It was like looking at a disaster in slow motion, except this time I had the power to stop it. I created a comprehensive analysis, documenting each risk factor and proposing specific solutions. My revised structure addressed every vulnerability I'd identified in the original deal, building in safeguards and realistic timelines. When I presented my findings to Denise and the rest of our team, the room went quiet. "This is incredibly thorough," Denise said, flipping through my report. "How did you identify all these issues so quickly?" I smiled slightly. "Let's just say I've seen this movie before, and I know how it ends." The presentation to Paramount's leadership team was scheduled for the following Thursday. I practiced my pitch dozens of times, refining each point until I could deliver it smoothly and confidently. This wasn't just about winning a client anymore. This was about proving that the expertise Thomas had dismissed and devalued was real and valuable. The night before the meeting, I barely slept, running through scenarios in my mind. What if they recognized me from the previous disaster? What if they associated me with the failure? But when I walked into Paramount's downtown headquarters the next morning, briefcase in hand and Denise at my side, I felt surprisingly calm. Their new CEO, Frederick Walsh, was a tall man, in his 60s, who'd been brought in specifically to turn the company around after their various partnership problems. He shook my hand firmly and introduced me to his executive team. "We're looking for someone who can help us avoid the mistakes of the past," he said, his tone suggesting he was tired of disappointing results. "We've been burned before, and we can't afford another failure." I set up my laptop and began my presentation, walking them through each element of my proposed structure, explaining not just what to do differently but why each change mattered. I was halfway through explaining the financial restructuring when I noticed one of the advisors in the room staring at me with a strange expression. He was probably in his late 40s, wearing an expensive suit and an increasingly uncomfortable look. When I paused to take questions, he spoke up, his voice hesitant. "Excuse me, but have we met before? You look familiar." My stomach tightened, but I kept my expression neutral. "I don't believe so. This is my first time working with Paramount directly." He frowned, clearly trying to place me. Then his eyes widened slightly with recognition. Wait, you worked on the original deal attempt, didn't you? You were with Sterling and Morrison. The room went silent. Everyone turned to look at me, and I could feel the temperature change, as suspicion crept into their expressions. This was the moment that could destroy everything. I could deny it, deflect, or make excuses. Instead, I decided to face it head-on. Yes, I said clearly. I was the senior analyst on that project. I was also the person who identified every risk factor that eventually caused the deal to collapse. The advisor, whose name tag read Peter Holloway, leaned back in his chair. I remember now. You were in that final meeting. The one where your director blamed you for everything going wrong. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Frederick Walsh looked intrigued rather than concerned. You predicted the failure, he asked. I nodded, choosing my words carefully. I submitted multiple reports over 3 months outlining structural weaknesses in the deal. The financial backing was unstable. The timeline was unrealistic. And several vendors had problematic track records. My concerns were documented and forwarded to my director. But the decision was made to proceed anyway. Peter Holloway was nodding now. I was in the room when Sterling and Morrison's team presented their postmortem after the deal collapsed. The director, Thomas something, insisted the failure was due to analyst oversight. He never mentioned receiving warnings. Thomas Brennan, I said quietly. And he received detailed warnings. I have copies of every email and report I sent him, all time-stamped and archived. The energy in the room changed again. Walsh exchanged glances with his team. I could see the calculation happening behind their eyes. I wasn't the person who caused their previous disaster. I was the person who tried to prevent it. Show us, Walsh said, leaning forward. Show us exactly what you warned about, and how your current proposal addresses those issues. For the next hour I walked them through everything. I compared my original risk assessment with what actually happened, showing how each prediction had come true. Then I demonstrated how my new structure specifically addressed every vulnerability. The meeting ran 2 hours longer than scheduled. By the time we finished, I'd answered dozens of technical questions and walked through multiple scenario analyses. When Frederick Walsh finally stood to conclude, he looked at his team with a decisive expression. I think we've found our consultant, he said. Within a week, the contracts were signed. Pinnacle Consulting was officially partnered with Paramount Industries for a comprehensive restructuring project, with me named as the lead consultant. The fee was substantial enough that Denise couldn't stop smiling when she showed me the signed agreement. This is the biggest contract we've landed in 3 years, she said. And it's entirely because of your expertise and honesty. I'm giving you a 20% raise, effective immediately. You've earned it. But more than the money or the professional victory, what mattered was the feeling of vindication. The same deal that had been used to destroy my reputation was now rebuilding it. The knowledge that Thomas had dismissed was now being valued and compensated appropriately. Word spread quickly in industry circles. Within days, I received LinkedIn messages from former colleagues congratulating me. Some mentioned carefully that they'd always thought the blame placed on me was unfair. Others were more direct, saying they'd heard interesting things about what really happened with the original Paramount deal. Through the professional network that connects everyone in our industry, information filtered back to me about what was happening at Sterling and Morrison. Thomas was struggling. After the Paramount disaster, other clients had grown wary. 2 major accounts had declined to renew their contracts, citing concerns about project management and transparency. Internal morale was reportedly at an all-time low. Several talented analysts had left the firm, tired of working in an environment where leadership threw employees under the bus to protect themselves. Thomas had developed a reputation, the kind that follows you in whispered conversations, and careful warnings passed between colleagues. People knew he was someone who would sacrifice his team to save himself. The firm's managing partners were apparently concerned. Quarterly revenues were down 18% year-over-year. They'd launched new business development initiatives. But potential clients were harder to convince. When your company's name was associated with high-profile failures. I heard all this through Vincent, my former colleague, who'd touched my shoulder sympathetically on that terrible day in the boardroom. He'd reached out after hearing about my success with Paramount, and we'd met for coffee. "It's like karma is finally catching up," he said, stirring his cappuccino. "Thomas keeps trying to pin problems on other people, but everyone's starting to see the pattern." 6 months into the Paramount project, on a Tuesday evening while I was reviewing quarterly reports in my apartment, my phone lit up with a message request on LinkedIn. The name made my heart skip. Olivia Chen, one of the junior analysts, who'd been on my team at Sterling and Morrison. Her message was brief but loaded with meaning. "Jessica, something's happening at the firm. They're conducting an internal audit of the Paramount deal. Your name has come up. People are asking questions. I thought you should know." I stared at the message for several minutes before responding. An audit meant they were digging into the project files, reviewing communications and documentation. Meant someone somewhere had started questioning the official narrative Thomas had constructed. I thanked Olivia for the information and asked her to keep me updated if she felt comfortable doing so. Then I walked to my closet and pulled down the box I'd stored there months ago, the one containing all the printed documentation from that sleepless night after I was forced out. I hadn't looked at it since moving to my new apartment, but I'd kept it, some instinct telling me it might matter someday, that someday might be arriving. Over the next week, Olivia sent occasional updates. The audit had apparently been triggered by a whistleblower complaint, though she didn't know who'd filed it or what it specifically alleged. Senior management was involved. People were being called in for interviews. The phone call came on a Friday morning, while I was preparing for a client presentation. The number was unfamiliar, but something made me answer. "Jessica Hartwell. This is Richard Coe from Sterling and Morrison's compliance department." My hand tightened around the phone. "I'm calling regarding our internal review of the Paramount Industries project from 2 years ago. We understand you were the senior analyst on that engagement, and that there were some communications regarding project risks. We'd like to request copies of any documentation you may have retained from that period." My mind raced. This was either an opportunity or a trap. "What specifically are you looking for?" I asked carefully. "Any correspondence, reports, or memos related to risk assessment and communications with project leadership, particularly Director Thomas Brennan. We're trying to establish a complete timeline of decision-making during the project." I thought about the box in my closet, stuffed with evidence that told a very different story than the one Thomas had presented. "I do have documentation," I said slowly. "I kept copies of my reports and emails for my own records, but I'd like to understand the context of this review before I share anything. Am I being investigated?" "No," Richard Coe said firmly. "You're not under investigation. We're reviewing leadership decisions related to the project failure. Your documentation would help us to understand what information was available to management during the critical period." I met with Richard Coe the following Tuesday at a neutral location, a conference room in a downtown office building, used for depositions and legal meetings. I brought 2 complete sets of documentation, one for him to keep and one for my records. He was a serious man in his early 50s, accompanied by another compliance officer, who took notes while we talked. I walked them through everything chronologically. The initial concerns I'd raised about Paramount's financial structure in March. The follow-up memos in April when additional red flags emerged. The detailed risk assessment I'd submitted in May, explicitly recommending either restructuring the deal or walking away entirely. Every document was time-stamped. Every email showed delivery receipts. The paper trail was indisputable. And Thomas Brennan's response to these warnings. Richard asked, his expression carefully neutral. He told me I was being overly cautious, and that Paramount was too important a client to lose. He instructed me to proceed with the deal as structured. Despite my concerns, I documented those conversations in follow-up emails to protect myself, which apparently wasn't enough. They asked about the boardroom meeting, where Thomas had publicly blamed me for the deal's failure. I described it in detail, including his claim that he'd never received warnings, and his statement that I'd failed to communicate critical concerns. Did anyone else witness these communications between you and Director Brennan? Richard asked. He nodded. Several emails were copied to other team members, and I presented my concerns during at least 2 team meetings, where others were present. The weeks following my meeting with Sterling and Morrison's compliance team felt like waiting for a storm that you could see building on the horizon, but couldn't predict when it would arrive. I tried to focus on my work at Pinnacle, but part of my mind was always elsewhere, wondering what was happening in those investigation meetings, what people were saying, whether the truth would finally matter. Olivia continued sending occasional updates. The audit had expanded beyond just the Paramount deal. They were apparently reviewing other projects Thomas had overseen, looking for patterns. More people had been interviewed. The atmosphere at the firm was tense and anxious, with everyone wondering who would be affected. When the investigation concluded, then on a Thursday afternoon in late October, my phone rang with a number I now recognized. Jessica, this is Richard Coe again. I wanted to update you on our findings. I sat down at my desk, my heart pounding. Our investigation confirmed that Director Thomas Brennan received multiple detailed warnings about structural risks in the Paramount Industries deal, all of which he ignored or overrode. Furthermore, we found that he deliberately misrepresented the facts during the post-project review, falsely attributing the failure to your negligence, when the documented evidence showed exactly the opposite. He paused, and I could hear papers rustling. We're escalating this matter to the executive committee. This represents a serious breach of professional conduct and fiduciary responsibility. I wanted you to know that your analysis was correct. Your warnings were appropriate, and the failure to act on them was not your fault. The official announcement came exactly 1 week later. Vincent sent me the internal memo that had gone out to all Sterling and Morrison employees, though by that point the news was already spreading through industry networks, faster than any internal communication could travel. The firm announces that Thomas Brennan has been terminated from his position as Director of Client Relations, effective immediately. This action follows an internal investigation that revealed serious misconduct related to project management and disclosure of critical risk information. Sterling and Morrison remains committed to the highest standards of professional integrity and client service. The memo was clinical and careful, the kind of language legal departments craft to acknowledge wrongdoing without exposing the company to excessive liability. But everyone who'd been paying attention knew what it meant. The person who'd destroyed my reputation to save his own had finally faced consequences. My phone exploded with messages, former colleagues reaching out to congratulate me or apologize for not speaking up sooner. Professional contacts who'd heard the news and wanted to reconnect. Even a few reporters from industry publications asking if I'd be willing to comment on the situation. I declined all interview requests. This wasn't about public revenge or making Thomas suffer more than he already would. It was simply about the truth finally being acknowledged. The email from Sterling and Morrison's HR department arrived on Monday morning, 3 days after Thomas's termination was announced. The subject line read, "Professional Opportunity, Confidential." "Dear Jessica," it began, with a tone that tried for friendly, but landed somewhere around desperate. "In light of recent organizational changes and the findings of our internal review, We would like to extend an offer for you to return to Sterling and Morrison. In a senior leadership capacity, we recognize that you were treated unfairly during your previous tenure, and we would like the opportunity to make amends. They were offering me Thomas's old position, along with a significant salary increase, and what they described as a comprehensive benefits package that reflects your value to the organization. They even included a formal apology for the circumstances surrounding my departure, and an offer to correct my employment record, to show that I'd left on good terms. I read the email 3 times, waiting to feel something. Satisfaction maybe, or vindication. But mostly I just felt tired. They wanted me to come back, to fix the mess Thomas had left behind, to rebuild client relationships, and restore confidence in their ability to deliver results. They wanted to use my name and reputation to signal that they were serious about change. But they'd only reached out after they had no choice, after an investigation forced them to acknowledge what they should have recognized. 2 years ago, when I was sitting at that desk, with trembling hands, trying to show them proof of my innocence, while Thomas talked over me, I took 2 days to consider the offer, though I knew almost immediately what my answer would be. Denise noticed I was distracted and asked if everything was okay. When I told her about Sterling and Morrison's proposal, she leaned back in her chair with a knowing smile. "Let me guess," she said. "They want you to come back and save them from themselves." He nodded. "Senior director position. Thomas's old role, basically. Significant pay increase. And you're going to say no?" It wasn't a question. She could read my face easily by now. "I'm going to say no," I confirmed. "I've built something here. That means more to me than a title and salary. You believed in me when nobody else would. You gave me a chance to prove my worth, without making me grovel or justify myself. That matters." Denise reached across her desk and squeezed my hand briefly. "That's real revenge, you know. Not the kind where you go back and show them what they lost. The kind where you build something so good somewhere else that going back would actually be a step down." I typed my response that afternoon, keeping it professional and brief. I thanked them for the offer and the apology, acknowledged their commitment to improving their organizational culture, and politely declined. I explained that I was happy in my current position, and had no interest in returning. I wished them well in finding the right person for the role. 6 months after Thomas's termination, I received an unexpected invitation. The Business Ethics Council, a non-profit organization that promoted transparency and accountability in corporate practices, was hosting their annual conference. They wanted me to speak on a panel about navigating professional retaliation and the importance of documentation. "Your story has resonated with a lot of people in our industry," the organizer explained when we spoke by phone. "People who've experienced similar situations, where they were blamed for problems they tried to prevent. We think your perspective would be valuable." I was nervous about speaking publicly about what had happened. I'd worked hard to move forward, and part of me worried that telling the story would trap me in the past. But another part recognized that staying silent meant others might not learn from my experience. I accepted the invitation. The conference was held in a downtown hotel ballroom filled with several hundred professionals from various industries. When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the podium and looked out at all those faces, some young and hopeful, others weathered by their own professional battles. I told my story honestly. I talked about the early warning signs I'd ignored when Thomas started dismissing my concerns. I discussed the importance of documentation, not because you expect the worst, but because protecting yourself is a form of professional self-respect. After my presentation during the networking reception, I was approached by a distinguished-looking man in his 70s, who introduced himself as Frederick Walsh's predecessor at Paramount Industries. "I was CEO when the original deal was being negotiated," he explained. "I retired before everything fell apart. But I heard about what happened. When Frederick told me he'd hired you for the restructuring, I thought that was poetic justice. We talked for several minutes about business ethics and leadership responsibility. Then he mentioned something that caught my attention. Paramount is opening a new division, focused on partnership development and risk management. Frederick wants someone to lead it, who understands that preventing problems is more valuable than fixing them afterward. He asked me to approach you tonight to gauge your interest. I was surprised. I'm flattered, but I'm happy at Pinnacle. He smiled. I told him you'd probably say that. But the offer stands if you ever change your mind. It would be a VP position, overseeing all major partnership deals across the company. Significant autonomy, excellent compensation, and the chance to build something from the ground up. He handed me his business card. Think about it. No pressure, no timeline. Just know that people recognize your expertise and integrity. And there are organizations that would be lucky to have you. As the evening wound down, I found myself thinking about trajectories. 2 years ago, I'd been fired and humiliated. My career seemingly destroyed. Now I was being recruited for executive positions, speaking at conferences and respected in my field. I did some research into what had happened to Thomas after his termination. Through industry connections and professional networks, pieces of information filtered through. He'd applied for several positions at comparable firms. But his reputation preceded him. Word traveled fast in our relatively small professional world. Directors talked to each other. HR departments conducted thorough reference checks. People remembered the Paramount disaster. And more importantly, the investigation findings. I heard he'd eventually taken a position at a much smaller consulting firm, several steps down from Sterling and Morrison in terms of prestige and compensation. His title was ambiguous, suggesting they'd created a role for him that kept him away from major client relationships. The arrogance that had once let him dominate boardrooms and silence dissent had become a liability he couldn't escape. It was the kind of professional downfall that happens quietly, without dramatic confrontation or public spectacle. Just a steady decline, one closed door after another. As the consequences of his choices caught up with him, I didn't feel satisfaction exactly. Mostly, I felt a sense of balance being restored. The same character flaws that had let him throw me under the bus to protect himself had eventually consumed his own career. He'd created his own downfall through years of prioritizing ego over ethics, blame over accountability. On a quiet Sunday evening, almost exactly 3 years after that terrible boardroom meeting, I sat in my apartment looking out at the city lights, my new business cards, reflecting a recent promotion to partner at Pinnacle Consulting, sat on my desk. The Paramount restructuring had been successfully completed, and they'd signed a long-term consulting agreement for ongoing advisory services. 3 other major clients had been secured, based on recommendations from satisfied companies I'd worked with. My career hadn't just recovered. It had evolved into something stronger and more meaningful than what I'd had before. I thought about Thomas occasionally, but without the anger that had burned so hot in those early months. He tried to destroy me to save himself, and in the end, he'd only succeeded in destroying his own credibility. The truth, documented and preserved in those printed emails from a sleepless night 3 years ago, had eventually emerged. Justice, I'd learned, didn't always arrive quickly or dramatically. Sometimes it moved slowly, working through official channels and procedures, accumulating evidence until the weight of facts became impossible to ignore. And sometimes the best revenge wasn't revenge at all. It was simply living well, building something meaningful, and trusting that integrity eventually matters more than politics. The city lights sparkled below, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Genuine peace. Not because Thomas had fallen, but because I'd risen. Not through tearing someone else down, but by staying true to what I knew was right, even when it cost me everything. That night, looking out at those lights, I finally understood what Denise had meant months ago. Real revenge isn't about making someone else suffer. It's about becoming so successful in your own right that their opinion of you becomes irrelevant. I smiled, finished my tea, and got ready for another week of work I actually loved.